Hello, everyone, and welcome to Deal International's webinar session on carbon credits and how they will affect the art industry. So when I was doing my live panel discussion today and my introduction for the two panelists who are participating in the conversation, my microphone got garbled up and you couldn't hear a word I was saying. So I'm recording this separate intro so that you can have a qualified understanding of who these individuals are. Joshua Tosteson is the Chief Operating Officer of Everland Marketing. Josh has dedicated his 25-year professional career to serving people on the planet on a journey of sustainability. From 2011 to 2016, Josh served in a variety of leadership roles at Rainforest Alliance, including as Senior Vice President of Programs. Currently based in New York, Josh is responsible for building and supporting partnerships with the projects that Everland Marketing supports, and leading project selection and due diligence process and overseeing our impacts program. Laura Tapping. Laura is the Carbon Program Manager of Sustainable Travel International. Sustainable Travel is where Deal International sources our carbon credits for our clients. Laura will soon be receiving her Master's in Sustainable Development. Sustainable Travel is dedicated to minimizing the negative impacts of tourism and maximizing its positive benefits for people, cultures, nature, and wildlife around the globe. So, without further ado, here is our actual conversation on carbon credits and what they are. Thank you for watching. So Laura, do you want to start off with basically telling us like what is a carbon credit and how it works?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, your sound was very garbled to start with, but now it's better. So fingers crossed it will be okay. Yeah, so essentially a carbon credit allows you to emit 1 metric ton of carbon elsewhere. So it's actually possible for us to measure the amount of carbon that's emitted into the atmosphere, either by ocean shipments or ground or air shipments, which I'll come on to later. But once we've measured that, we can then actually offset the equivalent amount of carbon. So to offset 1 metric ton of carbon emissions, for example, you can purchase 1 carbon credit from a carbon offsetting project. So a carbon credit is equivalent to removing 1 metric ton of carbon from the atmosphere elsewhere. So, I mean, the importance of minimizing our carbon footprint is something that we need to address to start with, but obviously in businesses like this, it's not always possible to get rid of all of these carbon emissions. Some are inevitable. So the emissions that we are making, that is something we can do to mitigate that. So we can release carbon in one area, but we need to do something about it elsewhere. So that's where carbon offsetting comes in.
So how do we go about calculating these carbon offsets for our own shipments, for our art shipments?
So for your art shipments, at Detour specifically, well, we've actually, so what I'll do to start with, maybe I'll talk to you a bit about how shipments are calculated by us. But essentially, we have worked with Detour to create a carbon calculator. So you have access on your website to a calculator that us at Sustainable Travel have created, and we worked with you to so basically there's globally recognized carbon emissions, so emission factors. So every mode of transport has a different emission factor, whether that's a truck or a boat or an airplane, anything like that. So any shipment will have a different footprint. Now, whether it's an old vehicle or a new vehicle, whether it's traveling through the Rocky Mountains or across the plains of Texas, there are many different determining factors on the carbon footprint. So what we actually have to do is use a lot of averages to be able to calculate footprints. So it's not me that's come up with this. There's lots of scientific evidence that's come up with these factors. And the way that we can calculate a footprint from a shipment, so we can use the weight of the shipment, the distance that it's traveling, and then the emissions factor. So let me use trucking shipments, for example. So all of these emissions factors are open access, it's all out there available for you. So with trucking shipments, the emissions factor is 62 grams of CO2 per ton kilometre. So that means that every kilometre that a ton of shipment travels, it will produce 62 grams of carbon dioxide. Okay, so what we do is you multiply the shipment by the distance by the emissions factor, and that's the same for every type of transport that you're using. So whether it's an ocean shipment, an air shipment, trucking, it follows that same sort of calculation. There's just different emission factors for it.
So, and what we're doing is one of the areas that we have identified is that we can go into our offsets and look at the flight duration, and we break it down into averages for those flight durations. So ours is 1 to 3 hour flight duration, 3 to 6 hour flight duration, and 6 hours plus. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, the reason for that is that those different flight durations have different types of offsets. So those shorter flights actually put out more CO2 than the longer ones. Is that correct?
Yeah, because if you think about the amount of fuel that is used to get you off the ground in an aeroplane, you know, it's really a lot of carbon is emitted in that initial stages of getting you off the ground.
Yeah.
And then the same when it comes to landing at the other end. So the least amount of fuel is when you're cruising. So if you've got a longer flight, the ratio of carbon that's produced is actually lower.
Okay.
Because you're cruising for a lot longer time.
Super interesting. And that was the basics that I knew when we started doing the offsets. But I want to start talking a little bit more about, in detail, who sells these carbon credits, where the carbon credits come for, and that type of thing. And maybe Josh, you can jump in here and talk to us a little bit about this as well too. Can you tell us what type of companies do this, and what specifically your company does in terms of, are you an aggregator of carbon credits? Are you a broker? What is your role here?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just introduce kind of what we do, and then talk a little bit more generally about, you know, the let's say the ecosystem of how projects and the developers of projects that generate carbon offsets for sale connect up to the marketplace, because there are a few different ways that happens. Our company specifically focuses on a subset of the offset market, and that is the world of offsets that are created by projects that reduce emissions by avoiding deforestation and degradation of forests. The acronym for that is called REDD+, R-E-D-D, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And so there are, as Laura mentioned, there are a number of flavors of offsets, ways to generate carbon emissions reductions against some kind of a baseline. You can do it by putting in, for example, a renewable energy project that reduces the carbon intensity of the energy mix in a power grid. That's one example. Many different flavors of ways you can create projects that result in the reduction of emissions. And the kind that we work with, as I mentioned, is this sort of specific flavor. And we'll talk later about impacts and why. But the way that we work with projects, the developers of projects that go out into developing countries and basically put projects together that reduce and eliminate deforestation in areas that have highly threatened forests, they generate their carbon. We are like the outsourced sales and marketing division of those projects. We represent on an exclusive basis a collection of 7 and a sort of growing portfolio of what we consider to be really high impact projects around the world. And so we're paid like a broker, because when we sell credits, we're paid as a sort of portion of the sale from the project. So that's how we're compensated for the services that we provide for the project. But the operational motif for us is that we actually kind of embed with the project, and we're in a kind of like day-to-day operational alignment with the projects, and that allows us to face the market in a slightly different way than a broker. There are brokers too, and so there are many in our industry who operate that way, and they'll buy credits from developers of all different sorts. They're not usually specialized in one form of offset or another. They'll buy and sell, just like any broker does. That model we don't like doing personally, just because the visibility to the project is low or none about who the clients are and what the end pricing is. So there's a lot of opportunity to grab profit in the middle, and we don't like to do that. We like to direct as many of the resources as possible, down to the ground where the work is being done. Yeah. There are some projects that market and sell their own credits. That's another example. And then like Laura's company, what they do is pick and select an aggregation of what they feel are like really high quality projects, and they offer them on a platform. And then they'll do like bespoke work for clients like yourselves at Detail, and then your clients, so that you can serve your ecosystem of clients, folks who are imagining on the call today, with a really nice kind of customized service that keys off of the features of the platform and the availability of certain projects on the platform. So it's just maybe like a little bit of an overview of some of the ecosystem. I don't know if Laura, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think we have quite a similar relationship with the developers. So we like to work directly with the developers as well, because we want most of that money to make it to the project. The more people you have in the middle, everybody's taking a little, that administration fee off the top, and less of what you put to this offset budget, less of that reaches the project. So we work directly with the developers, but I think maybe less. I know that, Josh, you visit quite a lot of the project, which is really great. Maybe you have involvement with the development of the project as well, and any changes. We don't have that in-depth a relationship with them, but we just make sure that we do our due diligence at the start. So like Josh said, we have a portfolio, I think maybe 12 or 14 different projects that we've selected for a reason. And we don't chop and change that very often. We're not brokers. We don't go after the best deal. We choose the projects that we want to support.
So are there a lot of, I would say, because of the way that you are both supporting these projects, are there unscrupulous people out there who are selling these carbon credits on the market for a rate that is not advantageous for the projects themselves?
I think definitely. Over the last few years, it's just the number of carbon offsetting organizations has just shot up, and they're not all acting in the best interest of the project. There's a lot of money making organizations out there instead of, we're a not-for-profit, and many organizations aren't. They're there to make the money. And it's just a byproduct. It's just a happy chance that the project also gets some support as well.
Okay, I hope my sound is better now. If it's not, I'll try to talk as little as possible and let you guys talk. But I want to specifically talk, we have the option when we're estimating to select projects that we want to use. And I think it's important to note that different carbon credit projects cost different amounts to buy that carbon credit from. Can you speak a little bit about why the price points are different for different projects? Why do they cost different?
Yeah, sure. The carbon offsetting industry is a market. So all of the projects can be put onto, it's like a stock exchange almost. The developers can set the price. And there's some projects out there that if the credits aren't selling very well, maybe they put the price down, or if it's quite popular, they can put the price up. It can be tweaked that way. There are many different reasons for the prices being different in a project. So it can be, Josh can speak much more to this, I think, from his involvement, but it can depend on the location, on the initial investment that the project got. Does it need to cover its costs? Is it a particularly sought after project? Is it quite popular with the media? It's all about supply and demand with a lot of these. Is that what you would say, Josh? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways to look at the question of price and the question of value. You know, I'm sure in all of our industries, we think a lot about the relationship and the distinction between price, value, and cost. And on the cost side, there are a lot of variables that go into, you know, the actual operation of a really high quality project. Like in our world, RED plus, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, you know, it just like go take a mental journey, if you will, to a place like, I don't know, Cambodia, okay, where super corruption, not much rule of law, questions of land tenure are, you know, very dicey, and you have like a massive virgin forest that's still around, and poverty and all of that, plus wildlife trade, trafficking, illegal timber, all of these pressures. Here's a place that is being bombarded by threats. And so just think for a minute about how you stand up and staff an operation that will actually stem the tide,
Right.
Of all of this stuff. Actually, like, some of this work is not cheap. You know, you have to pay rangers, for example, to do all kinds of patrols if you're in a really threatened forest, for example. So there's all of that. Then there's the question of like reducing the ultimate drivers of deforestation, which are economic in nature and often have a lot to do with the situation of community members. And sometimes that's like a couple of 100,000 people who are living in an area around a project. And so think about how you stand up an initiative, sets of initiatives that can generate alternative sources of livelihood that are really good enough, strong enough, that they are compelling and somehow show that there's a dividend to be reaped by keeping the forest intact. So you just think about all that might go into that. You can imagine an effort that's costing millions of dollars a year to stand up. And, you know, then you can just do some simple math, you know, certain amount of credits generated a year. Here's the operating cost. Here's what the price needs to be to at least support de minima basic operations. And then there's a distinction between that and then having a path to actually creating prosperity on the ground. So this is a very long-winded way of saying that on the cost side, there are a lot of things that go into making a project really good. And when you're talking about projects like, you know, Laura's organization, our organization, we're selling carbon credits at a certain level, but what we're really selling is impact.
Right.
Okay. There's an asset that's being traded, but what's coming along with the asset are attributes that give that asset huge additional value. And that's really where the question about price and value come in, and the market side of things comes in, because there is a distinction between, you know, a very special project like we may talk about the Altamaya project in Peru in some time. There's a real difference between the kinds of things that are being done there and then like a solar farm located in Southern California.
I want to go directly.
Yeah.
I want to go into Altamaya, but real quick, I want to say this in case I was choppy when I said this to begin with. I want to state what the price point is for us to, DEDL is giving carbon credits basically at cost to our clients. And we pay any broker's fees or anything that we're dealing with Laura Sustainable Travel through DEDL. That doesn't get passed on to our clients. So the only thing we're doing is selling direct because we want to contribute to this and make it bigger. But in case you missed this in the beginning, if your average shipment is 150 kilos, that's 0.32 metric tons of CO2, and it only costs $2.72 to offset. To me, there is no reason that you should not be offsetting that. But to the bigger picture, and Josh, you and I were talking about this earlier this week, if there is, I think we average, there might be 100 million tons of freight that's shipped every year by all institutions across the globe. That's 215,202 metric tons of CO2 that can be offset. If these little shipments combined to make the bigger ones, we could offset that much. And you quantified that, Josh, with how much a project like Altamaya or another project does. Can you guys talk about Altamaya a little bit? I know you're both very involved in what that is.
Yeah, and I'm wondering about just a question before we start diving into that, because there might be a question on everybody's mind, which is like, wait a second, but how do you determine what the offset is? How do you certify that it actually is an offset?
Right.
And I wonder if maybe it's a good, like before we launch into the
Sure.
world
Yes,
of how one's generated on the ground and the impacts, it seems like an interesting question that
how are these verified?
yeah, something like that.
Let's go ahead. So let's talk about that. How are these carbon credit projects verified for authenticity?
Yeah, so I'll be happy to maybe start, and I'll take it first, just a little perspective. In one of my previous roles, when I was the SVP of programs at Rainforest Alliance, we one of the divisions I oversaw was a division of auditors. If you can believe such a thing exists, there, we had a business unit of sustainability auditors, and we were the largest verifier in the world to the verified carbon standard. So we verified at least half, probably more than half of the world's REDD+ projects while I was at Rainforest Alliance. And just to talk a little bit about this, first thing to note is that what you guys are doing is purely voluntary action. You are deciding that you want to take responsibility for your carbon footprint, and you want to do something about it through offsetting. So where you're going, you're not being obligated to do so by regulation. There's no applicable law that is telling you you have to reduce your emissions. You're deciding to do this on your own. And so what that means, first of all, is that you're going into the world of voluntary carbon offsets. There's nothing to do with any regulation. This is voluntary. And so the way that voluntary carbon offsets are dealt with is through independent third-party standard systems, which provide the principles, the criteria, the whole set of standards that govern the sort of scientific and technical work that goes into determining whether and to what extent a project is actually reducing emissions against some kind of a baseline. Okay, so the first thing, voluntary projects, and then governed by voluntary, independent, third-party standards organizations, non-governmental standards organizations. There are a few of them around. Our organization only works with a nonprofit that's called Verra, and they have promulgated what we believe is really the world's best, most technically rigorous, independent set of standards dealing with how you create a voluntary carbon offset. It's called the Verified Carbon Standard, VCS, and it covers a wide range of different potential projects, including REDD+, which is the type that our organization works with exclusively. Generally speaking, the framework of this is, in the case of reducing emissions from forests, from deforestation and degradation, the way that you think about it is this. Here's a threatened forest. Meaning, year after year, because of the kinds of pressures that I talked about earlier, you're seeing forest loss, maybe 4 or 5% a year. Maybe it's more, but 4 or 5% is really a lot when you think about it. That's a high rate of deforestation. And so year by year, you're going to lose a little bit more, a little bit more. And often what we find is that after certain critical mass of fragmentation and whatnot, all of the function of the forest and its biodiversity kind of is lost, and then it really goes. So imagine over a 30-year period at a certain rate of deforestation, what you've got is basically going to be gone in that period of time. Think about that as the baseline deforestation rate. So without the project, carbon, imagine the stock of carbon. Think of this as a pool, okay? And in your pool or your bathtub, the forest is like a bathtub, and it's holding carbon. It's holding carbon in the trees, it's holding carbon in the soil, it's holding carbon in that leaf litter in between the trees and the soil. Just think about it like a big bathtub holding carbon. And because you're cutting down the trees, burning the forest, you're emptying the bathtub of its carbon so that by the end of 30 years, it's gone, okay? Mm-hmm. But now imagine, so here's what that curve looks like. Now the project comes in and you stop deforestation. And so Here is your loss of carbon. It's 0 because you've eliminated deforestation. The emissions that you have reduced, you have avoided deforestation, and therefore you have avoided the emission of this much carbon. That's the concept. And so what goes into verifying that concept in the world, on the ground? Well, first of all, you have to have technical protocols that govern how you determine the baseline. How do you actually determine? Because it's not what, it's what would have happened in the absence of the project. It's a counterfactual. So we have to acknowledge it's not what is happening, it's what would have happened.
Right.
And so, and that often is a piece of criticism actually for this whole endeavor. And we can talk a lot about that, but just to stay with the question, how do you verify? I'm going to come to the punchline at the end, but these are the ingredients, just so you kind of understand what goes into this. You need to have a technical methodology, a set of methodologies that give you a good and a process to develop a good, robust, defensible, based in reality idea of what that baseline would be. Then you have to have monitoring of the actual deforestation. Okay? Yeah. And what you need in between those two things is a good understanding of carbon stocks in your forest are. So you have to be measuring all over the forest to determine how much carbon in total is there. And by basically taking what would have been lost with what is being preserved, understanding what's there, then you're going to quickly be able to determine what you're actually avoiding in emissions. And the way that that's done is that the project develops a massive array of technical documents. There are methodologies and protocols that are developed by the standards body that are informed by a huge amount of consultation and involvement with the scientific community. And those result in these protocols that the projects have to use in order to provide in their project documentation, what is the baseline, what's a valid baseline, what are our carbon stocks, and so forth. And then third-party auditors, independent auditors like Rainforest Alliance, very well-trained, accredited auditors go in and they spend huge amounts of, so a typical audit for one of these carbon projects might cost between $20,000 and $50,000. It's really expensive. It's a huge level of effort because the stuff that they check and what they do is a massive amount of work. And what they're doing is looking at what is that actual deforestation rate. They're over checking all the calculations about the carbon stocks. They're going out. These are technical people who go out into the field and do all this work. And at the end of the verification exercise, the verification audit, which covers a certain period of time, they look at, okay, what was the actual deforestation rate? How much would have been lost under that baseline? So this is the actual performance for a period of time that has been achieved. We know there was no deforestation. We know what it would have been. We know what the carbon stocks are. You have been verified to issue out this much in the way of carbon credits. Yeah. And that's not in a nutshell. That's how the process is.
And on that note as well, I wanted to talk a little bit about leakage. So another thing that the third-party auditors and the verifiers will check for is something called leakage. It's all well and good going into a rainforest and protecting this area of the rainforest. No deforestation is happening there anymore. But the illegal loggers just move into a different area. So you don't have the deforestation in this area, but you still have these loggers that need a job. They need to make money. If they can't do it in this area, which we're now protecting, they'll just do it elsewhere. So you need to get to the root cause of that. The root cause of that is these people need a job and they need money. And at this stage, illegal logging is how they make that money. So if you're a project developer, you need to think of ways to diversify their livelihoods and another way for them to make a living. So in the project, the Alto Mayo project that we'll talk about in a moment, you know, there's things like coffee plantations where they teach them more organic ways of growing coffee. So as logging, they can make money from selling coffee on the international market. You know, organic certified coffee. So instead of them having to go elsewhere to cut down trees and release carbon into the atmosphere, they've got this more sustainable livelihood, and even after the project ends, they can continue with this livelihood. And it's the same, we talk a lot about the forestry project because that's what we know a lot about, but there's also projects where we provide water filters for in Cambodia, so rural areas in Cambodia who have to collect firewood and burn the water to make their water safe to drink. So with the project that we work with there, they provide water filters. So instead of having to burn the wood and create all of this pollution in their homes and release the carbon, they can actually just use this water filter and drink the water straight away. But if to make this water filter elsewhere is using a lot of carbon, or it takes a lot of carbon to ship it in, that's also a form of leakage. So it all needs to be accounted for, and that's what we don't have to do. That's what the third-party verifiers are there for, to make sure that it is a legitimate project and we're not just moving the project, moving the problem elsewhere.
And it's just one small point about that, because I'm so glad you brought that up. And one of the ways that the possibility of leakage is actually treated within the framework of the standards, and also in the issuance of credits, is that there are actually defined leakage zones. So a project will actually is required to identify vulnerable high-risk areas sort of in adjacent areas, and those have to be monitored to actually see whether that is taking place. And one of the things that they do is when you get a verification that allows you to issue credits, they actually withhold a certain amount depending on the level of risk that is assessed by the auditor, to what Laura is saying. So what is the risk of having significant leakage? And if no matter whether it's a little bit or a lot, depending on that, they're going to take some amount of the credits that have actually been generated by the project and they sock them away in a buffer pool.
Got you.
Yeah.
So I have a question on this real quick, and we have a couple questions from the people watching, so I'm going to get to those. We will get answers to those, but real quick on these projects. So are those leakage areas that you said have been set aside as you have to identify those? Does that happen before the project gets put into place?
Yeah, that's part of the design of the project. So when you're creating the project, designing it, you have to do that as a condition of having the project validated. So the first step in generating credits is the whole design of your project, which includes things like how you're setting your baseline, how you're determining your carbon stocks, where your leakage areas are, all that stuff is captured in a document. It's called a project design document. And that first has to be validated by VCS, by the standard organization, via a third-party auditor. And just a small word about the credibility of these organizations, because I've worked for and with organizations involved in developing and auditing to voluntary third-party standards for sustainability. And what I'll say generally is, like in anything, there's a kind of a spectrum of organizations in terms of their quality, their rigor, and their credibility. And for those that are really good, like best in class, they're outstanding. The issues and challenges associated with the work that they do isn't at the level of are these credible people doing technically rigorous work with great safeguards? They more have to do with the inherent challenge of the endeavor itself. So how do you really create a baseline that's a valid one? It's actually not an easy question to ask, and you can put great thinking to it and great technical protocols to it. And that won't change the fact that you're providing a counterfactual as the basis for the production of an offset.
So I want to get to these two questions, and thank you for your patience, everybody listening, because I am thoroughly, I love this stuff. So we could go on talking about just these specific things. But one of the questions is, do these credits count for materials used in shipping, such as crates and packing materials? So do you guys want to discuss that?
Yeah, I mean, we had this conversation just this morning, Jason, because with the calculator that we have worked with you to create for your website, this, it says the weight of the shipment, but this weight includes the crate, doesn't it? From my understanding.
We're using volumetric kilos to basically account for the larger volume that is taken up on the airplane when it actually ships. But carbon credits themselves are based on actual weight too. More so, right? I'll let you go into the.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. When we calculate it, generally it's done by the weight times the distance times the emission factor that I spoke to you about. But you need to think about, if you were going to ship 10 crates of feathers, for example, and we were to use the actual weight of that, it might be that you then aren't responsible for any sort of carbon footprint because these feathers are so light. But on this airplane where you're shipping these feathers, you're taking up so much space that, the carbon footprint of this airplane has to be shared by everybody on it and all of the shipments on it. If you're taking up this space that somebody else could be taking up, then really you should be responsible for that shipment, for that footprint.
And the other note too, and Fritz is in the comments here mentioning this, but it does not account for the manufacturing of that crate, and it doesn't account for the things that go into actually creating that crate. That is a separate thing.
Yeah, that's exactly. So these calculations there's nothing to do with the supply chain in this. We would love to do that with some of our clients. We actually get more detailed and work with their supply chain, but this is literally just the transportation of it.
Yeah, and this goes into the second point of the second question on here is there a separate credit to account for courier travel? So I know you do this. So, and we are offering to offset couriers or directors from galleries when they fly to go see artists or exhibitions. You want to talk about that, Laura?
You probably know more about it because.
Well, I mean, offsetting people.
Yeah, offsetting people, exactly. Yes. So I think to offset a person, it's usually about, for every mile traveled, it's 0.5 pounds of carbon is produced, or 227 grams of carbon is produced for every mile that's traveled by a person. Right. So we just use those figures and multiply it by the distance that's being traveled. So on the calculator online, you just tick that there is a courier going with the shipment and it will calculate that. So obviously we're Sustainable Travel International. We started by offsetting for tourists and travelers and people moving all over the world. So on our website, we have a calculator that's dedicated to just people movement. So if you're flying from A to B, you can just put in the distance of your flight and it will use the emission factors I spoke about to calculate how many metric tons of carbon you emitted by flying from London to Los Angeles, for example.
Josh, we sort of skipped over when we were talking. Do you want to say, I know you have been on the ground at Alto Mayo. Did you want to add anything about Alto Mayo specifically and about what it's doing to help the community, or how does that work?
Well, maybe, I mean, I'd be happy to, and Laura, I believe, is writing a master's thesis on the very topic too, so I think we can have a fun conversation, and I'd be happy to just get it started. Actually, I've been talking to the developer team at Conservation International all week.
And why, but I guess the other question is too, why are we talking about Alto Mayo? Why is it important to talk about that specific one?
Well, I think it's a great example of the way in which this mechanism of offsetting can actually result in a transformative impact. Like, what do we care about when we're doing this? Like, okay, we're going to cancel out our carbon footprint, but we want some good to be done in the world. And what does that mean? Like, as it relates to deforestation, wouldn't it be great that, like, I knew that this amazing forest in the northern part of Peru, in the Peruvian Amazon, which is one of the most biodiverse areas of the world, culturally diverse, very precious area. What if, in purchasing this offset, I was helping to ensure that this forest is preserved for all time? And I think Alto Mayo is a wonderful case study of a living answer to that question that is actually like in actual reality delivering to that promise. And the way that it is doing it, to Laura's really wonderful invocation earlier, what it's doing is intervening in the dynamics that have been driving deforestation in the Alto Mayo in such a way that by replacing that destructive dynamic with a truly sustainable livelihood for the people and the communities living, I must say illegally, within that forest, they are eliminating the root causes of why the forest was being lost, and instead helping to create durable prosperity. And so the high level about the project, what does that all mean in practice? This is a 180,000 hectare forest, unbelievably beautiful kind of cloud rainforest. It's in the highlands, the Andean Amazon, so the highlands of the Amazon. This is the western part of the Amazon. Most of the Amazon basin is in Brazil, but then its headwaters are in these mountainous areas.
In Peru, correct?
Western side, yeah, mostly in Peru, but Bolivia also. And it's to some degree Colombia, Ecuador. Unbelievable area. And so in this area, what's happened is that starting in the 1970s, like thousands of people were moving around the country and decided to go settle there in this area. And it had been established in the 1980s as a protected area. And so what ended up happening is you have a whole bunch of people living in a protected area, and the government, and what it was happening was that they're mainly coffee growers, principally coffee growers, terrible farming practices. So it's just the classic thing of like slash the forest down, crappy farming practices, make a few bags of low quality coffee, sell it around, rinse, lather, repeat, and that was, it made the area basically the most highly deforested, most highly threatened protected area by far in all of Peru during this period of time. Meanwhile, it's now a protected area, and the government comes in all ham-handed, and they get these rangers and they try to evict people. And this led to like a total violent armed standoff between the settlers in the area and the government. Basically, the government couldn't go in there. The rangers couldn't go in there. They couldn't do it. It was not permitted because these folks really protected themselves and their land, and they kept cutting down the forest. So the Conservation International is the international NGO that has come in to develop this project. They got into an agreement with the Peruvian government to jointly manage this protected area. There's a legal mechanism in Peru that allows for that. And what they decided to do instead was to say, no, we don't need to go in and do any enforcement here. We're going to come with an offer, a voluntary agreement. We're going to come with an agreement, voluntary conservation agreement. Here's what we'll do. You farming family, if you agree, it's your choice. You can do this or not. There's so much socialization that went into this, but they're going around literally like on backpacks deep in the forest to these families. Here's an agreement. Let's talk. What we want to do is protect this forest, and we want to see you have a good livelihood. Neither of these things are happening right now. So if you agree not to cut down the trees, here's all the things that we'll do in return. We're going to come in and give you dedicated technical assistance and training. And we're going to show you how to grow coffee in an ecological way, increase your quality, increase your productivity. We're going to help you diversify so you're not just vulnerable to the coffee price, okay? And we're going to help you access high value markets for your coffee. And we're going to help you diversify even further if you want to get into ecotourism or what have you, okay? And one by one by one, by now they've signed agreements with over 1,000 families. There's a majority of the families living in this area. And over the years from about 2000, and I guess the project started in 2008. From that point on, it was slow, grew and grew. And what's happened now, and Laura mentioned this, the growers have now formed a cooperative. All this technical assistance went into helping these guys form an actual cooperative. I've been on the ground there in the Alto Mayo. I mean, the farming practices that they employ are as good as any you'll see in the world. I mean, it's true ecological farming. Don't get me started on that. I could go on all day, but it's very beautiful. And they put together a world-class Q-grade lab. If you guys know anything about like grading for quality for coffee, but like it's a very important thing if you want to produce coffee for international market standards. And the Q lab is this really essential thing for providing feedback to the growers on their practices, especially post-harvest, so they can meet international quality standards. All of a sudden, you've got this group, fair trade certified, organic certified, and producing ultra high quality coffee, and their incomes have just shot up. Right. So just last year, over $1 million was the value of their sales of specialty coffee. And now they've been doing this diversification, specialty crops like dragon fruit, and that generated another $400,000 of income for these families. And so all of a sudden, this prosperity is going up and up and up, and the deforestation has stopped. So it's just a wonderful story of like market-oriented conservation and livelihoods being the route to durable conservation in a very tough situation. So,
and this is specifically why Fritz Dietl wanted to start offering these credits to help do these type of things and contribute to those type of projects. How long do these projects last? What's a lifespan of a project?
Yeah, so, you know, RED projects, these kinds are typically, the ones we work with are conceived of as 30-year projects. The idea being like, that's about the right amount of time to come in, deal with the root causes of these drivers, grow trust, pilot activities, scale them when they work, and then crest on the other side with critical mass. And that's where the importance of steady sales of the offsets is so critical. This isn't charity. In charity, you pay an NGO in advance and hope that results are delivered. This is a pay for performance, because when you buy an offset, it's performance that's been already delivered.
Right.
So it's very powerful mode. But the 30-year bit, the whole idea with this isn't about going in and doing some little intervention. This is about turning the tide for good, saving the forest with a durable model.
And I mean, this is what I've been writing my master's thesis about. So about the community benefits provided by these projects and how sustainable that will be. So these projects will come to an end eventually. And you don't want all of that money just disappearing from their lives and then they go back to illegal logging or the slash and burn techniques that they were using before. So, I mean, with this Alto Mayo project, it's really good because as well as the cooperatives that the coffee growers have developed to help them access the international market, they've now got relationships with the local governments, and their capabilities and capacities are just growing, and they're going from strength to strength. And I know that Conservation International are starting to hire the local people to, into the head office of the Alto Mayo Protected Forest to help with the administration and the management of the whole area. So, and he also told me, I interviewed the developer, and he told me about the positive leakage effect that they're having there. So the people that originally didn't want to be included in the project, like Josh said, it was voluntary. You didn't have to be involved. The people that were maybe a bit reluctant are now seeing how prosperous people involved in the project are, how well their coffee is selling, how well their dragon fruits are selling, and their land is just flourishing. So now they want in, which is great. And they offer, Conservation International offer lots of training into the organic farming practices, and now they're offering that to people who weren't even, they haven't signed an agreement.
Yeah.
We have a question here, and I want to get to this. I also want to say we only have 10 minutes left. So there's a couple things I want to jump to on this. We want to get to this question because it's a really good question. It is, in the future, might there be a political component to offset prodigious trade and debt structures that force countries with smaller economies into debt, harmful farming practices, or forced migration? If we're talking about the root causes, how far upstream are your organizations willing to go? If not now, then future? Are you as you build a capable infrastructure for such aims?
That is Such a great question. I'm so glad that was asked. You know, so like Alto Mayo is a great case study. And then I can give you some great case studies in other places where that question is more pertinent, very pertinent. I mean, Cambodia is the place that comes back to mind, because there are some places where like the forces, like you're speaking to like macro or at least significantly larger cultural and political forces that provide the context and the backdrop for increasingly more proximate drivers of the problems that you're facing. So like, what if you're in a place where like the threats are coming because you have the Chinese market with high demand for all kinds of species of illegal timber, who want to poach wildlife right, left, and center. And what happens if the area that you're in, the systemic corruption is tied to an entire political infrastructure that has been unchanged for 30 years, arguably for 40 or 50 years. Because like in Cambodia, it's basically the Khmer Rouge by another name, more or less, right? So there's all these structures that are holding in place, you know, so what do you do in the face of that? And what is the expansiveness of your intervention effort? And how do you drive systemic change when the ultimate drivers are at that scale, and what your actual mandate to do is somehow to protect, you know, a 500,000 hectare block of land.
Right.
It's way beyond like the scope of this webinar. There is no answer to that question, actually. There are lived experiments trying to work on that. It's really a big challenge. And it has a lot to do with forming partnerships and coalitions with other organizations that address different pieces of it, right? Because like, if there remains a high demand for trafficked wildlife,
ivory,
people are willing, whatever, then it's hard. You know, your solution of patrolling around is a low leverage solution in that context, because if it's like with the drug trade, you know, no amount of interdiction is going to prevent drugs from flowing into the United States from Latin America, because we're willing to pay lots of money to support our habits, right? And so the place of ultimate leverage is that.
I guess one of the things that I think would be helpful then is maybe I can collect some links and helpful resources from you guys that we can provide to people so that they can further learn about some of these things if they'd like to. I'll get that from you guys after this, if you're willing.
It's a brilliant question.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I think that was a great question. Okay, quickly, sort of, I had a couple other questions. I wanted to know about greenwashing and blue carbon, but I think really what we should do is jump to the end question, which is the future of the carbon credit market. What do you guys see as the future for carbon credits, the market in general, and how that looks long term?
Yeah, I mean, to start with, I want to talk about carbon offsetting right now as well, because I think it's really important.
In the age of COVID, even right now.
Exactly, that's what I mean, because we all know that there's less pollution right now. There's less traveling, so, you know, less people are actually offsetting. So this is really problematic for these projects who rely on this constant flow of money from offsetting. They didn't envisage this. The coffee growers, you know, that have developed this relationship with the international markets didn't see that there might be a drop in sales, or the fact that tourists aren't visiting the ecotourism lodge that they've got there. They didn't plan for this drop of money. So I think offsetting at this time is more important than ever, because they really need this consistent flow. If they're not getting it from the other avenues that they usually get it from,
right,
you know, they need to be getting it from offsetting right now. So I just want to kind of reiterate, I know that the shipping industry is still quite strong at the moment, despite this. But yeah, we still need to be offsetting our carbon, whether you do it for the last 10 years, just to make sure that you're offsetting something. It's just really important to get the money to these projects.
Josh, your comments on that?
Okay. So here's what I'm seeing. It's not really like an opinion, but what I think what is happening. We are on an inevitable path to decarbonizing our economy, and I know that not just because as a greenie environmentalist, I think it should happen. I know that because some of the very largest emitters in the world, who are actually the source of all this problem, like the huge oil and gas majors, have committed themselves to the course of action of decarbonizing their companies and the energy that they are supplying to the world. So go take a look at the public announcements of companies like Shell, Total, Repsol, and others, and just reflect on it, because that's the path that we're going on. And these are commitments that these companies have made. And while everything deserves a healthy dose of skepticism, anyone who deals with huge companies like this knows that when they go out publicly and make time-bound specific commitments like this, they're marching the company strategically in that direction, and they're putting the force of the company behind it. That's what they do. So we are going on a path to decarbonization, and that path is going to be long because the infrastructure shifts that need to take place, the technological innovation that needs to take place, there is a lot of it that's going to have to happen. So this is a 30-year ride. And the imperative, though, to stabilize the climate in the interim is massive. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And it is recognized by the oil majors, by the mining companies, by the really large emitters. And what they are doing right now, what is happening right now, is these companies are all beginning to stand in line and take significant positions in carbon offset projects. And when I say significant, I got an email while we were talking, and we've just been asked by an oil company to do a 3 million ton transaction, like in the next week. Okay, so we talked about the footprint of the art industry and the shipping in the art industry at about 200,000 tons a year. So this is, more than 10 times that, boom. And that's what's starting to happen. So I think that the future of offsets is crucial. It's actually necessary. It's a necessary component of the bridge to a decarbonized economy. And what I feel really wonderful about it is that pathway, by passing through an increasing volume at a better price for offsets, means that threatened forests around the world, there's a business model and a way now to take a proven mechanism and do what's being done at Alto Mayo at real scale, so we can put a fence around all of the remaining threatened forests in the world and save them and save life on Earth in the process. So
last question from me. Because the art industry is such a small fraction of that, why is it important that we still do this? I mean,
is that really a question?
I'm saying that as a rhetorical. I know why it's important, but
I think that the art industry, you have such a wide reach to everybody out there. You've got this opportunity to lead by example and educate everybody. Everybody loves some form of art, no matter what that is. It touches everybody. So there's this opportunity to impact everybody. If we start doing it in the art industry, it's just a snowball effect, and it spreads out. Yeah. That's my opinion in it.
Thank you both for taking the time to really go into detail on this stuff. I think it's really important that everybody be educated on what this is and why it's important that this takes place. You both have been incredible, and I have really enjoyed speaking to you over the last 2 weeks. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for inviting us. It was really good to talk to you.
Okay, have a good one, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.